welcome you to this podcast of Grandpa Don. Again, I am here to tell some stories, and one of the questions that came from you, my grandkids, was, why did you become a pastor? How did that happen? Well, that's a good question. I don't know sometimes myself why I became a pastor. It's a very complicated thing in some ways. But I will tell you some stories of, I think, what led me in that direction, and that was that as a child I was raised in the church. Like a lot of you are very familiar with church, and for me it was the Lutheran Church. The Lutheran Church was, in this particular case, the Augustana Lutheran Church, which was Swedish in its identity as an ethnic group. Although we had Norwegian parts of our family, we belonged to the Augustana Lutheran Church. That's how I grew up. It was a country church. It was the center of our lives and our gatherings, even as extended family, because all of my dad's brothers, at least initially, belonged to the Augustana Lutheran Church, and it was at center. Center was the name of the church. It was the center of our lives. And so that's how I grew up, and that's what I knew, and I went to the church. I was part of growing up there in listening to the sermons and the worship service and all of the things that are familiar to you and were to me from being in the church. We had Sunday school, and we had Bible school in the summertime. We would be maybe 2 weeks in summertime to have summer school, Bible school as it was called then. And that was always a lot of fun. That's when I would play softball. We'd have softball games after for recess in our Bible school. And that environment then became formative for me. The pastor that was at the church, especially during the time of my maturing, was Pastor Moline. Pastor Paul Moline was his name. And Pastor Moline was a fellow who saw that his mission was to ask every boy that was going through confirmation, and of course I went through confirmation, and he would ask us and encourage us to consider the possibility of becoming a pastor. That was his work. That was part of his emphasis. Now, in this church that I grew up in, the generation before me, there were 3 people who went into ministry. One was a pastor. He was a man, and that was the point of it too, I need to tell you. At that time in that Lutheran church that I grew up in, only men would be allowed to be pastors. I know that's true in the Catholic Church still, and many other churches that continue that practice. And so it was only boys who were considered worthy, I guess, of becoming pastors. But we had 2 women in our church who became missionaries. And they went to Tanzania, or as it was called, Tanganyika, a country in East Africa where we had a mission of our Lutheran Church, of the Augustana Swedish Lutheran Church in America. And they would come back from time to time to tell stories about their mission work. And that was always impressive to see the slides and the pictures of African young people and things that I would never imagine or know about otherwise. So I'm trying to tell you that this was a very important part of my life and the life of my family. Now, in my school, in my public school that I went to, I also had a teacher in 5th grade, I remember. She was asking us kids different times about what our interests were and what we thought we would like to do when we grew up. And for some reason, I remember her wondering to the whole class whether or not I would be somebody who would go into ministry. And of course, that was something I was thinking about, wondering about, considering, if you will, and I'm 10 years old now. I'm not that old, right? And so this was planted as a seed in conversation in school. I remember coming home, telling my mother and my dad that in school they were asking about what we wanted to be when we grew up, and that I had said, and the teacher thought it was a good idea, that I will be a pastor. Now, I have to tell you that my father told me afterwards that after that conversation, he couldn't sleep all night thinking of me being a pastor. He was so worried about me and about what that would mean for me if I were to become a pastor. And I guess what he knew was that in the church that we grew up in, and he was on the church council in some of these situations, and he saw some of the I would say difficult things that the pastor had to deal with, and the opinions that people would have about the pastor, not always positive. So he was, I think, protective of me in that sense, and so it bothered him and wondered. Well, of course, at the time, that was not on my radar. I did not think about that as being an issue. But I just felt the draw to be in something important that I could do and something that I could believe in. So the church was a big part of what I was exposed to. I was thinking, of course, as a youngster about other things, and what I remember was that my dad made it clear to me and to all of us kids that, you know, if any of you are thinking about going into farming, don't count on it. There's no money in it, no future in it for us, and if you kids want to do something, you're going to have to go out and get an education and go somewhere else and do something else in your life. That was a clear message. It tells you how difficult it was for my parents on the farm, that their livelihood was not very good, and they didn't see it as something that was going to get better or more productive in terms of income and money. So that was the situation. Now there was another position or kind of work that I knew about, and that was being a teacher. Obviously, I knew teachers because I went to school. So it was the teachers, the preacher, and farming. That's what all I knew. There was no other jobs that I had any real understanding about. I did know that my mother's sisters were married to a couple of men who in Sioux Falls had other jobs. One was a salesman who was going around and setting up grocery stores, and that was his work. Another one worked in some kind of a building where they had storage of materials, you know, and so he was working in this building and along the railroad tracks. That's what I knew. I didn't understand what he did, but I knew that's where he worked. And another kind of job that one of my uncles had was for a while he ran a restaurant in Sioux Falls. So there was those kind of things too, but I could never relate to it or figure out how that would work, or if I'd be even interested in it. So this is the kind of world I was living in as a kid. I didn't see many options other than what I've told you. The church was, as I said, very important to me, and even my public school teacher thought of me as a kid that might become a pastor. And as I said, I was 10 years old at that time, which would have been 1954 maybe. That was pretty early for a kid to be able to say, I want to be a pastor, or I'm thinking about it. Now, when I was in 5th grade, that was also a very important time because that's when I had my first surgery related to my polio. And that's when I was in the hospital for a week or more. And as a child and a kid, that was a totally new experience, and I didn't know what I was going to have to do or what was going to happen to me. I can tell you that we knew in our family, my father knew a cousin of his whose daughter had polio. And there was this doctor in Sioux City, Iowa, that was helpful to her in her polio. And they recommended that they take me to this doctor in Sioux City. Sioux City was on the edge of Iowa, and I think you can find that on a map. And that was the city that I was taken to, and this doctor looked at my leg and foot and all of the things that are there, and he was describing what needed to be done, and he recommended that there be a surgery to do some changes in my foot because part of the muscle that was in my leg was withering away, and therefore the ability for me to lift my foot normally was maybe not going to stay there. I was going to lose that. So he had an idea that he would transplant muscle across from where the muscle was pretty good to the side which was withering and try to at least find something that would work. So that's what he did, and that was the surgery I had when I was in 5th grade and 10 years old. I remember in that hospital laying in the bed, and nobody was there to support me. My parents dropped me off to at the hospital for the surgery, and they had to go home because, they were farmers, and somebody had to milk the cows and feed the chickens and keep everything going, and they really couldn't have the luxury of being away from home when I was in the hospital. So you can see how that would maybe feel if you were like that as a child, if you just were dropped off at the hospital and strangers were taking care of you and you had no other people to talk to that you knew. That was very, very memorable for me. I remember when I woke up from the surgery, this is kind of funny to me, they had my leg suspended above the bed, so my leg was in a cast, and my leg was bent, and the cast was up to the top of my leg in a bent fashion. And when I saw that they had a kind of a thing hanging over the bed, a structure that they had hooked up screen door springs that you have on your screen door, or the old ones anyway. The old screen doors had a spring, and they had just used screen door spring to hold up my leg in the air, so that that's how I was. That was my first impression. You can see they were pretty primitive those days in terms of using things from other situations rather than made especially for the hospitals, which is what they do today. Everything is so sophisticated today compared to then. So that was my really deep time of wondering and thinking about my life. What does this mean that I have this surgery? And to be honest, I wasn't sure when I went into that surgery what would happen to me. There was always the talk, their surgery is always risky, and there's always a chance that something, could go wrong, and and there's a possibility that you could end up, people sometimes would die, and so that was when you're a little kid and you're 10 years old, and somebody says that you could die if you go into this hospital. You think about that, and that's what I did. I felt like maybe this would be the end. I didn't know. So when I woke up, I was happy to be awake. And that was a little bit of it. So this whole thing about, really thinking about, I could die. What would that be like? I mean, the mystery of being alive in the first place, and then to be faced with the possibility, at least, of death. That was quite a big impression on me. So I've said that in a sense I faced the possibility of my own death when I was 10 years old, just mentally at least. So that was my experience with that, and I did survive, of course, and I got taken home, and I was so glad to get out of that hospital. I want to say that probably was an event that really impressed me on the idea that doing something really important with my life was important for me to do, and the ministry seemed to be the important thing to do. Giving my life to the Lord and serving God as a pastor. Well, okay, so after that surgery and so on, it's a little bit later, a few years later now, and I have a book here that was given to me by the pastor and by the church, the Sunday school. In 1958, I would have been confirmed. And so I was given this book, and guess what the title was? Why I Became a Pastor. And it was 20 true stories by Lutheran pastors telling their story about why they became a pastor. I still have that book. I'm looking at it right now as I'm talking to you. And on the inside of the cover it said to Donald from Salem Sunday School and Reverend Moline, June 9th, 1958. 3 John 2. So he references a scripture for me. Now in this was a book of stories about pastors who, were really important people in the Augustana Lutheran Church, and I've read a little bit of them lately just to review them. Most of these were people who had been in World War II and came back. I was born during World War II in 1944. That's when our nation was in the Second World War, and it was a very difficult time. And these were young men who were called upon to go into the military and various positions, and those experiences certainly gave them some reason to wonder what they should do with their life after they came out. And so these are people who came to be pastors in the church at that time. One of them, whose name was Dallas Young, his story was the last one in the book, and that was what I could relate to because Dallas Young was a pastor that I knew at least a little bit at that time. And the fact that he was in there gave me a sense of being possibly connected to this kind of person that was a pastor, other than the pastor that was in my church. So, of course, that led me to the idea that I needed to go to college. I needed to get an education. And you have to know this, that in my life, my parents were not highly educated. I can go back to my grandfather, Knudsen, Andrew Knudsen, and he had a 5th grade education. That was as much education as he had. My father, he went to the 8th grade. He got an 8th grade education, and then after that he started helping being on the farm, and of course became a farmer. So education was, to be able to read and write checks and, try to understand some of the basics of daily life from reading and all of those. So in those days it was reading, writing, and arithmetic. That was the three things that you had to learn: reading and writing and arithmetic. And then the rest of it was you had to figure out on your own, I guess. So I'm just saying that for my family, my father and my grandfather, 5th grade education, 8th grade education. Now my mother, she had a high school education. She was most educated in the family, interestingly, because she went through high school, graduated from high school, and then she went to beauty school. So she was wanting to become a hair beautician. That was what she did when she was a young woman. Of course, and she got married and became the wife of a farmer. And being she was a beautician, she did all of the cutting of our hair, and she loved to curl my sister's hair, and sometimes she'd try to curl mine, and she liked to do that sort of thing. I think there's a picture of that sort of thing somewhere in my family picture books. And then my mother would always fix the hair of people that are neighbors or others in the family, extended family. She could give them a permanent, and that was something I saw happen quite often in the summertime, especially in our house. Well, that's a way for me to say that when I wanted to be a pastor, I had to go to college, and nobody that I knew had ever gone to college. Nobody that I grew up with. The only person that went to college would have been the pastor that was in my church. So that was a big step, and I went to Augustana College in Sioux Falls, which was the closest college. It was a Lutheran college, as maybe you know, and still is. And that was my big outing, to go to get an education. I didn't know what to major in college, because in my mind, all I wanted to do was become a pastor. And well, when you go to be a pastor, well, what would you do? You'd study religion, of course. You'd study things about religion. But that wouldn't be a smart idea when you're in undergraduate study. You should learn about other things. And of course, there were other things that you had to learn a little bit about. General courses in physics and chemistry and stuff like that you could choose. And you learn something about English and literature maybe, and there were certain, requirements, basics as they called them. And so I did learn some of those things, and then I kind of wandered off into history courses about Western civilization and so on. And also I discovered something called philosophy, which I had no idea existed. And so I got interested in that, and by the time I got done with my high school or college education, I had, I think I was 3 credits short of a major in philosophy, and I had a history major. So if I would have taken another course, I could have had a double major, one in history and one in philosophy, but that didn't matter. I was going to the seminary, wasn't I? And the seminary was, things were changing. The seminary that my pastor had gone to would have been Augustana Seminary in Rock Island, Illinois. That's where the Swedish seminary was for the Augustana Lutheran Church pastors. But by the time I was going into the seminary, there was a merger going on in the church of the Lutheran churches. And so the seminary that was down in Rock Island, Illinois, had been closed, and the seminary was being joined together up in Chicago. And they were merging the two seminaries, and Chicago Theological Seminary was what it was called. And I wasn't too sure about going to Chicago. I'm a kid that didn't venture very far beyond the pasture of the farm. Going away to Chicago just didn't I couldn't imagine it. And so the seminary that was the closest was in St. Paul, Minnesota, and it was, or Minneapolis and St. Paul, Minneapolis Seminary for the new merged church, and it was called the Lutheran Church in America now. And the Lutheran Church in America had a seminary in St. Paul and Minneapolis, and it was called Northwestern Lutheran Seminary. As it turns out, they were a bunch, mostly Germans. There was a Swede or two in there, yes, they did have that. But it was an ethnic, more emphasis, I would say, from some of the German tradition of Lutherans. So I went to seminary in Minneapolis. And so from there went on. I could go on and talk all about that, I suppose, but that would get too long, and I can tell you that what has happened to me in the time I'm living now is that I got to come back to the Minneapolis and St. Paul area where I had some of my education, and this brought me back into connection with some people that I went to seminary with who have returned or have lived in the Twin Cities, and so that's been a rewarding thing to do, since my ministry was oftentimes out in smaller towns, as maybe you all know, places like Jamestown, North Dakota, Pelican Rapids, Minnesota, Thief River Falls, Minnesota, Minot, North Dakota, Glenburn, Lansford, North Dakota, and so on. Well, I hope you found some interest in this little story about how I became a pastor or why. I can tell you that it's been an interesting way to live one's life. It's been one that I've had very good memories for, and sometimes a lot of pain and difficulty too, because of some of the kinds of human dynamics and interactions that can occur in such settings. But here I am, and I will tell you more whenever you want to know something else. I hope this will at least give you an idea of how I came to be a pastor. And thanks for asking the question, and those of you who have listened, thanks for listening, and have a wonderful day. God bless you all.